Okay, hello everyone. We have Professor Réka Juhász today. She's an assistant professor of economics at the University of British Columbia, where she focuses on industrial policy and industrialization. She's the co-founder of the Industrial Policy Group, a lab dedicated to delivering core empirical research on industrial policy. Her research has been covered on the NPR, the Financial Times, The Economist, Time Magazine, among other influential publications. Previously, Professor Juhász was an economics professor at Columbia University and a postdoctoral researcher at Princeton University. We will begin with a 20-minute presentation by Professor Juhász, followed by a 20-minute look into one of her papers, Temporary Protection and Technology Adoption, Evidence from the Napoleonic Blockade, with my co-host Tom. Then finally open up to a 15-minute Q&A with the audience. Please join me in welcoming Professor Juhász.
Okay, so thank you so much for having me. I wanted to share some slides, but I think sharing is not enabled yet.
I just made you a co-host, so
okay, let's see. Okay, let's see now. Yes, good, we're in business. Right. Oh wow, this opened up. Okay. Let's see, there it is. Okay, so just check the time. Thanks so much for having me. I encourage you all to turn your videos on so we can make this a little bit more interactive. Please interrupt me at any point. This is supposed to be sort of a 20-minute presentation. I'll try to stick to that as much as possible. So what I want to do in this first part is sort of talk to you all about what with some co-authors, in particular Nathan Lane and Danny Roderick, we've started calling the new economics of industrial policy. And so this is really going to be based partly on a paper that with Lane and Roderick we have forthcoming in the annual review, but it also touches on some other work, a working paper that we have out with Nathan Lane, Emily Olson, and Veronica Perez, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. And sort of more tangentially, a paper on the history of the historical sort of track record of industrial policy that I co-wrote with Claudia Steinwander, and which is coming out also in the annual review of economics. So really where I want to start today is with this kind of basic question across the social sciences, which asks whether states have a role in shaping the composition of economic activity. That is, should the state use the variety of policy levers that it has at its disposal to try to sort of actively shape what is produced domestically in the economy. So traditionally, this has really been thinking about whether the state should try to move the economy out of agriculture and into industry, so to kickstart structural transformation. A more contemporary example in sort of the US context would be whether the state has a role in trying to move the economies from sort of a fossil fuel-based economy to one based on renewable energy sources. Okay, and this idea, which we're going to call industrial policy, this is an idea that has been controversial really since the birth of modern capitalism. So on one side of the debate, you have people like one of the US founding fathers, Alexander Hamilton, who famously advocated for a strong government role in precisely this type of industrial policy. But more generally, there's sort of a long line of people through Friedrich List in the mid-19th century, more recently Alice Amsden, who have said not only that this type of government involvement in the economy is important, but that indeed it's necessary for structural transformation, or more broadly, for long-run growth and development. Now, of course, on the other side of the debate, industrial policy has also been the subject of sort of a lot of skepticism. And I just wanted to kick things off today by showing you sort of just how long the history of skepticism is. This is sort of a caricature from the early 20th century, I think, in the US. And I really like this because it kind of gets to the heart of what a lot of people worry about when they worry about industrial policy. So the context to all this is sort of thinking about infant industry protection. And what you see on this drawing is sort of the metaphorical infant industry labeled sort of protected privilege that's clinging to its mother or its nurse. She's labeled high tariff. So this is the high tariff protection being afforded to the infant industry. And the baby is kind of wailing, it's screaming. Why? Because it's being sort of offered the bottle of open market competition. And so what this kind of picture gets at is this idea that in practice, when we think about industrial policy, what industrial policy actually ends up meaning is either it becomes captured by special interests, or sort of from the get-go, industrial policy is just kind of code for the government sort of handing out goodies to well-connected firms, friends, sectors. Okay, so it's nice to be talking to you all at the University of Chicago because, of course, some of the most prominent sort of pushback to industrial policy has come from University of Chicago economists. So Gary Becker famously quipped in 1985 that the best industrial policy is none at all. And I think for the most part, this is where much of sort of mainstream economics has landed on for the past 2, 3, 4 decades. We've really sort of, as a profession, strongly come out and advocated really sort of blanket against all forms of industrial policy. And this is actually meant, or this is actually implied, that industrial policy hasn't really been an active area of research, at least in mainstream econ, until very recently. Now, of course, as you will all know, this has become sort of particularly challenging because industrial policy has kind of become the signature economic legislation of the current US administration. So not only is sort of the Biden administration doing industrial policy, but they're also sort of announcing very, very loudly that industrial policy is going to be sort of the new stance of sort of the US government writ large. So, you know, at a very practical level, one of the messages that I want to sort of convey to you all today, and hopefully there are some sort of budding economists among you, is that kind of industrial policy is a reality that whatever you think about it, economics can no longer ignore. And the other message that I want to sort of give you, and I'm going to sort of develop this a little bit more in the next couple of slides, is that we need sort of less ideological opposition to this topic as a profession and more sort of careful mainstream work using sort of frontier empirical, structural, and theoretical tools that we as a profession have developed in the last couple of decades. And what I want to get into the meat of today is that what we call the new economics of industrial policy is really an attempt to do just that. Okay, so give me 1 second because I still have a bit of a cold. So I need like 1 second. But this is a good point to pause and see if anyone has any questions. Okay, so I'm going to try to do 4 things real quick. I'm going to try to give you a definition of what industrial policy is. We've actually found in our work that this is extremely clarifying, and I'm going to talk about some of the implications. I then want to talk a little bit about what the economic rationale is for industrial policy and why economists in general have been pretty skeptical of this idea. And then I want to give you like the 3-minute version of what recent research in industrial policy has sort of revealed. I want to tell you kind of what the frontier knowledge is about the practice of industrial policy. So we think of industrial policy, and this I already kind of anticipated in my very first slide. The way we think of industrial policy is government action that very intentionally seeks to transform the structure of economic activity in pursuit of some goal. So this is really sort of the government messing with the relative prices in the economy through different policy levers with the kind of idea that it is trying to achieve some sort of long-term vision that it has for the economy, be that structural transformation, energy transition, geopolitical goals, or whatever. But there are two things that I want you to take away from this. One is that this is sort of very intentional, and the other is that it's selective in some way, right? That you're really trying to change relative prices. You're favoring certain activities implicitly at the expense of others. Now, why is this helpful? I think we found it helpful in a lot of our work because it really clarifies what industrial policy is and isn't. So one, I think, arena in which it's been sort of very practically useful is that typically a lot of the old research on industrial policy has looked at the effect of industrial policy through its effect through basically tariffs. But tariffs, we know, can be used for a variety of reasons. Most importantly, historically, tariffs have been sort of the main source of government revenue, but we also know it can be used for things like terms of trade. So this is a problem because when you look at a country's tariff schedule, that's really not going to tell you much about its industrial policy stance, given that it's confounded with a bunch of other sort of reasons the government has to put tariffs in place. The other problem is that industrial policy can be many things. It's not only tariffs. It can be subsidies, it can be innovation policy, it can be land grants, it can be technology policy. And all these other policy domains sort of suffer from the same problem, that they can be used sometimes for industrial policy and sometimes for not. So our goal is to sort of move sort of our conceptualization of industrial policy away from thinking about policy levers and more to thinking about concepts. It's, I think, also clarifying because people typically associate industrial policy with sectoral targeting, or what we think of as kind of vertical policies. So a good example of this would be sort of the Chips and Science Act currently being pursued in the US, which is trying to target advanced semiconductor manufacturing. And again, this is, of course, one aspect of industrial policy, but industrial policy is much richer than that. And so we're missing out on a lot when we only focus on vertical policies. And sort of my personal pet peeve is that in our definition of industrial policy actually clarifies that industrial policy is not necessarily protectionist. You know, of course it can be, import substituting industrialization policy being sort of one prominent example. But as I'm going to show you, or I'm not going to show you today, but as we've shown in some of our work, a lot of contemporary industrial policy is actually very outward looking. That is, it is trying to get firms to participate more intensively in international markets. Okay, so why do industrial policy? What is the economic rationale for doing industrial policy? Well, actually, this is kind of very, very vanilla and very standard. The scope for policy intervention is basically the same as any other policy domain. What sort of basic Econ 101 teaches us is that there is a scope for the government to come in when there is some reason why the market is not functioning well, when it is not delivering sort of socially desirable outcomes. And that is what we call a market failure. So sort of the one sentence answer is the justification for industrial policy is market failures. And if you take an Econ 101, this should be in no way surprising. Moreover, you know, the other point that we try to sort of make in the annual review paper is that these are the justifications, the market failures that people sort of think of when they think of industrial policy are very numerous and they're widely accepted. So we give sort of one categorization of market failures in the paper. I don't want to go into sort of detail about these. I just want to sort of make 2 points. One is externalities. So positive externalities are kind of a textbook rationale for industrial policy. This is a scenario when an activity produces externalities that are not recouped in the revenues generated for the person undertaking the activity or the firm undertaking the activity. And again, I study regional urban economics, and if you've taken a course on regional or urban economics, these sorts of externalities, the idea that a firm is not going to capture all the benefits that accrue from its production, this is sort of like baked in to all of our workhorse models. These are not sort of controversial market failures. The other one that I want to point out is activity-specific public inputs. I want to point this out because we usually think of public goods as being quite horizontal, meaning that they're not selective, they're pretty untargeted. But actually, a lot of public inputs are pretty activity-specific. So if you think about, for example, the charging stations that we need to be rolling out to make the take up of electric vehicles sort of a reality, that is going to be an excellent example of something that is very much an activity specific public input. Okay, so at this point, given that I've tried to make the point that these are very sort of well accepted standard market failures, you might wonder, why has the profession been so skeptical? And the objections are really not about the market failures. The objections are really about what happens in practice when the government goes about doing industrial policy. And there are really sort of two forms that these objections take. One is going to be what is known as the information problem. So this is the idea that, I can tell you about market failures and we can sort of write down our models in which some sectors have a market failure and some sectors don't. But in reality, when you go out into the real world, policymakers don't have an easy way of observing these market failures. And so this is sort of a form of the classic kind of the government can't pick winners problem. The government just doesn't have the necessary information to be able to conduct industrial policy well. The other sort of main class of problems that people raise with industrial policy are the political capture problems that I alluded to with sort of that caricature at the very beginning. The idea being that in practice, what is actually going to happen is that industrial policy is not going to go to the activities that suffer from a market failure. They're going to be captured by well-connected firms, by well-connected sectors, and by other sort of forms of rent seeking. And so sort of the punchline of all this is that I think our traditional stance in econ has been that the government failure that you get when you try to do industrial policy is always going to be bigger than whatever market failure you're trying to correct. So to put it very bluntly, the cure is kind of worse than the disease. Now, I don't want to be flippant about these objections. I think they're very real challenges, and I think that we have sort of very well documented sort of episodes where it seems likely that political capture or information sort of derailed industrial policy. But I would also say that this idea that there's kind of a general tendency that the government failure is always sort of, no matter what you do and no matter what context you look at, the government failure is always bigger than the market failure. This kind of consensus really emerged before economics became a very empirical field. And so I just think that there's a, in sort of technical speak, there's just like a much bigger confidence interval around that statement than the confidence with which we've sort of gone out into the world and said that industrial policy is a bad idea. And really what the new economics of industrial policy does is it challenges this consensus. It challenges this consensus that industrial policy can't work, that government failure is always bigger than the market failure, both with sort of better measurement and with better econometrics. And I'm sort of mindful of time, so I'm just going to give you sort of the headline results here. But what we have done in some of our work is, first of all, just to sort of provide basic stylized facts around industrial policy, precisely because we've had such a hard time measuring it in the past. And so what we've done in work with Lane, Olson, and Perez is we have moved away from sort of trying to measure industrial policy based on specific policy levers. And we've used sort of natural language processing techniques to actually look at what policies show sort of an intentionality that is consistent with that definition that I gave you. And what we get from that exercise is we see that industrial policy is on the rise, but also that it never went away. So this idea that, this idea that the US until very recently was not doing industrial policy, that is a myth. That's a myth that has, been very much questioned, particularly outside of economics. And we know that the government sort of, particularly through its sort of military industrial policy and defense industrial policy, always been active. But I think now we have sort of more systematic data that speaks to this. And the thing that sort of surprised us actually initially, and our priors were sort of different here, is that industrial policy, at least based on our measurement exercise, seems to be much more prevalent in rich, advanced economies than it is in poor economies. And there are good reasons why that might be the case that I can talk about a little bit later. So in the interest of time, let me just skip through some of what those findings are and talk a little bit about the empirical evidence. I'm just going to sort of give you the 1-minute summary. And this, I think we worked hard to summarize in the annual review paper. But really what contemporary empirical evidence that has sort of emerged in the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years shows is that in 3 particular arenas of industrial policy that have been particularly controversial, we see actually a surprising amount of evidence of sort of positive behavioral responses. What I mean by that is that in many cases, natural experiments or otherwise, we see the policy eliciting the type of behavioral responses that are in line with what the policymaker intended to do. So let me just give you sort of the headlines for 3 of these. So one is public R&D, and the sort of typical view here has been, or the typical worry is that if the government starts getting into the business of doing research and development, particularly the applied aspects of it, that this is going to kind of crowd out private investment. We actually find from microdata the opposite. By we, I mean the profession. So this is not a paper that I co-authored. But we also have emerging evidence on more sort of moonshot public R&D, in which the policymaker is not sort of trying to change incentives on the margin, but it's really sort of massively getting involved in picking sort of particular technologies for prioritization and sort of really getting into the weeds of the entire R&D effort. There are sort of 2 papers that speak to this quite directly. One is the World War II R&D effort in the US, and the other one is kind of the classic moonshot, the Apollo mission. And what we sort of end up concluding is that, contrary to sort of the government failure view of industrial policy, at least in times of national crisis, the US government seemed capable of picking technologies, places, and firms that could deliver the desired outcomes. And these often had long-lasting positive local effects that weren't sort of intentional with the policy. Another sort of aspect of industrial policy in which I think there's been a lot of skepticism, but mounting evidence actually points to some pretty encouraging effects, is place-based industrial policy. So this is typically when you're trying to boost manufacturing, either in a distressed region or sort of a lagging region. And again, evidence, so here the sort of concern that we have is that if you're targeting a particular place, what you're really going to do is you're going to sort of reallocate economic activity from sort of the untargeted place to the targeted place. Now, what a lot of research tends to show is that actually we don't have a lot of evidence for these types of spillovers that would kind of undo the policy. And we actually see that again, in terms of sort of achieving what is often the primary objective of the policymaker, which is job creation, both in distressed and in lagging regions, we see this type of place-based industrial policy have pretty substantial effects. And then I'm not going to talk about this a lot because I think we're actually going to get into the weeds of this in a minute, but this has really been where I've done sort of a lot of the work during the PhD and directly after. I've been really interested in the infant industry mechanism. And both sort of my work and also my co-author Nathan Lane's work on heavy industry in South Korea, plus other work, has generally found pretty positive effects for traditional infant industry type arguments. So where I want to conclude is just to say that, you know, I don't think there's an easy answer here. Like any domain in policy, these are, you know, failure and success are probably sort of part of any policy, and the task at hand is not to sort of say, you know, industrial policy some sort of magic tool that's going to immediately drive sort of spectacular growth outcomes everywhere. I think the message that I want to convey is just that it's time to sort of normalize research on industrial policy. And for a long time, the debate has revolved around sort of whether we should be doing industrial policy kind of as a binary. And instead of that, a much more constructive approach would be to ask how to do industrial policy well. And there, I think the literature is really kind of in its infancy. And sort of my personal view is that, of course, the political economy challenges that skeptics raise are very, very real, but they're not insurmountable. And sort of our cases, the sort of case studies of success should kind of fill us with optimism that even in sort of low capacity environments, industrial policy has sometimes elicited the desired behavioral response. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Professor Réka Juhász. That was I think it's a very tantalizing sort of beginning presentation. We wanted to reserve 15 to 20 minutes to go really in depth into the paper that I think you're starting to allude to, which is the first paper I read of yours, called Temporary Protection and Technology Adoption, Evidence from the Napoleonic Blockade. And so if it's okay, this is just going to be like a very sort of informal introduction. I would like beg everyone to go read the paper for more after this. But hopefully we can work through a bit sort of just the motivation, the setting, the data that you use, the model and the results that you get. So if you could, would you be able to please start by giving us just maybe a 30-second elevator pitch for what the paper is about?
Yeah, so this paper is really sort of trying to get at the infant industry argument. In particular, this very old idea in economics that countries that are not at the technology frontier, so you could think of those as developing countries, when they first enter an industry, they need protection from trade temporarily, basically to reach their potential. And once temporary protection is removed, they can, if the infant industry is really there, they can sort of compete in international markets. And what this paper does is it presents a natural experiment in which this temporary protection is being driven not by tariffs, but exogenous variation in sort of natural protection. And I examine sort of the kind of technologically backward case of France trying to enter mechanized cotton spinning basically at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, so trying to catch up with Britain. And what the paper finds is that during sort of the 10 years in which this kind of natural variation in protection across France lasted, areas that were more protected from trade with sort of the technological leader, Britain, those areas expanded mechanization. And this also had long-run effects that suggest that indeed this short-run temporary protection changed the long-run profitability of the industry. That was more than 30 seconds, sorry.
Okay.
I'm out of practice.
No problem. I was being very optimistic. No problem. Hopefully we can go into more into the details. So this is, so if I understand correctly, you're looking to show that industries that were better protected from foreign competition were able to develop better later. Obviously, one big issue with this would be, for example, that so I could imagine that policymakers choose which industries to protect from foreign competition, and so showing that those industries then develop better might actually just be biased by the fact that the policymakers chose those specific industries. So I think I'd want to ask you first, what would you be looking for in an ideal experiment for for evaluating the feasibility or the truth of an infant
Yes.
industry document?
Yes. So, I mean, this has been kind of the classic problem with research and industrial policy, and in particular with sort of research on the infant industry mechanism. From what we just discussed, the policymaker is not choosing industries to protect at random. So we think that the industries that are getting protection, exactly as you allude to, are just fundamentally different to the ones that are not. And so the naive thing that you can do, which is to compare protected and less protected industries, or to sort of look at the tariff schedule that I was talking to you about and sort of regress the growth of an industry on the tariff rate that it receives. This is kind of what is classically being done. The sort of fundamental concern there is that you're not getting this random variation. So ideally, this is sort of the obvious problem in all of the social sciences, that we don't get to observe kind of two versions of history. What we really want to do is we want to look at French mechanized cotton spinning. We want to put them behind a high tariff wall, protect them, look at the outcomes, and then we want to sort of rewind, and then we want to sort of play out a version of French history in which they don't have any protection, and that would sort of settle the debate. Now, this is the counterfactual. You only observe the version of history that actually played out. You never observe the counterfactual. And so really, empirical economics has developed approaches to dealing with this. The famous minimum wage studies that were really kind of the natural experiments to do this. You can look up when they happened. Those studies were published in the late 80s, early 90s. So we've had these tools for a long time. But precisely because this was not sort of a topic of active research, no one had sort of really taken this kind of natural experiment lens and applied it to this particular question. And so that's kind of what this paper does, is to sort of take the standard mainstream tools of empirical economics and look for sort of a quasi-laboratory setting in which you can kind of do this counterfactual analysis.
Okay, and so in that case, I want to ask you what makes your historical setting almost quasi-experimental, and then also I'd like to follow up, maybe just justifying why are we interested in cotton at this point in time?
Yes. Okay, so basically, what the natural experiment sort of lives off of is the following. So this is a crash course in early 19th century history. France and Britain go to war, and Britain has naval military power. This is very important. France, Napoleon, he has land-based power. Britain has naval power. So usually when you're trying to do a naval blockade, what you want to do is you want to take your ships and you want to surround sort of strategic ports in Britain. But France doesn't have that power. So Napoleon tries to do sort of the next best thing, which is to use his land-based power to deny British producers access to European markets. But this is going to be really hard. The continent of Europe is huge. This is why this is not how naval blockades are traditionally done. This is really, really hard to do. And the natural experiment here lives off the fact that the blockade is unsuccessful. It's partially successful. So it's successful based on where Napoleon's military strength is strong. So he can implement the blockade pretty well along Northern Europe, but he kind of loses the Mediterranean and he loses much of Spain. And so what actually ends up happening is not that trade between Britain and France stops, but actually what happens is that trade is diverted to sort of more circuitous routes that are entering France through the south. And what this is going to do, that was a long explanation, but what this is going to do is it's going to mean that different parts of France enjoy different levels of protection from trade with Britain. It's almost like you're going to give sort of different parts of France different tariff protection, which we don't usually get to observe because tariffs are implemented at a national level. But here, geography is going to be sort of the stand-in. It's going to be sort of the natural protection that you get, because if you're a producer in northern France, you used to compete with British cotton yarn that was just coming across the channel. It was pretty cheap to ship. Now the yarn that you compete with is coming sort of through the Mediterranean on these very risky smuggled routes. So that's kind of the long answer to your first question. The second question is why look at mechanized cotton spinning. Mechanized cotton spinning is really sort of the canonical invention of the Industrial Revolution. So for centuries before, people had been hand spinning cotton yarn all around the world where cotton was grown. And what the British figure out how to do is they figure out how to mechanize this process. They figure out how to build machines that are going to spin this yarn instead of having women spin it at home. And this leads to massive productivity improvements. And we also have good reason to believe that the externalities that I talked about in the previous part, those externalities are there. And so there are these learning by doing gains to be reaped, which is what's going to make, for a second, come a country like France, which is what's going to sort of drive the market failure. So the idea is that France could be productive, but because they're latecomers, they're not able to enter the industry. They're not able to move down the industry-wide sort of long-run average cost curve, and they're not able to be as productive as they could be, because the market failure is basically inhibiting every single producer from sort of internalizing the fact that they all look unproductive today, but if they were to enter the industry, they would become productive in the long run.
Okay, I think yeah, thank you. I think that's helpful. I think so you mentioned the fact that so not all regions will be affected the same by the imposition of this this ban, which almost translates to a tariff, which makes me think that sort of each sort of sub-region in France will be exposed differently. Could you say maybe just a couple of words on how you construct that sort of exposure of each individual department in terms of so the data that you use? Obviously, I understand to go really into the details of this.
Yeah, so what I did was I tried to figure out basically what the challenge was in this paper was to try to figure out what are the routes through which smuggled cotton yarn is coming into France. And so what I used was a historical shipping newspaper called the Lloyd's List. So the Lloyd's is still a company that's around. Their insurance, it's an insurance company. And at the time, they underwrote a lot of they were the underwriters for shipping insurance. And one of the things that Lloyd's did was they produced information on the comings and goings of ships, which was important information for these insurance underwriters to know. And so what I had was these daily, or I think bi-weekly newspaper reports of ships arriving at various ports all around the world. And so what that allowed me to do was to figure out basically where the British shippers were taking their goods to be smuggled into Europe. And using kind of a least cost route algorithm, I then sort of tried to calculate how goods were making their way to different French departments before the blockade, when really they were sort of entering through French ports, and then later during the blockade when they were entering through third countries. Mostly they were entering through sort of islands that were in British hands, or then after the Spanish insurrection, a lot of it came through Spain.
Okay. I hope it's okay to combine two questions into one again. But so, given the idea that British competition was stopping French industries from industrializing at that point in time, with the imposition of the ban, could you say what you would expect to see if your infant industry argument holds, and then what you actually saw before and after the imposition of the ban?
Yeah, so basically there's a short run and a long run. And the idea, it's a little bit nuanced. So I'll give you sort of the crude version first and then the nuanced version next. So basically what happens in the short run is not super interesting because you shut off French regions from accessing British yarn. So then you think that the expectation would be that there would be more yarn produced in France. That's not sort of earth-shattering. So looking at sort of what is happening while French producers are not able to access British yarn at the same price or at all is not super interesting, but nonetheless, it's kind of a building block for what's going to happen. So it's a building block for sort of looking at the long run effects. But so first of all, you want to see the industry expand during the time of protection. Okay, we see that happen. And then the really interesting thing is what happens when you remove protection? Now, France doesn't remove protection fully. And also, I don't have a counterfactual for all of France. I have within French variation. So now what you want to see is, has this temporary event, has this blockade changed the long run profitability of the industry? And if it has, if the more protected areas of France got a head start in the French market, you would expect the more protected areas of France to thrive in the long run. That's what I find. The alternative hypothesis would be these areas expanded, but their underlying sort of cost structure didn't change. They didn't move down their long run average cost curve. If that's the case, then you wouldn't expect sort of variation in blockade protection to affect the long run structure of the industry. That would be sort of the alternative hypothesis. Now, the reason why the nuanced version is that because there's an alternative technology to mechanized cotton spinning, finding producers expand in the modernized technology in the short run is actually pretty interesting in and of itself, because very often sort of critics or skeptics of infant industry will tell you that even if you give an industry protection, they're not necessarily going to modernize. So this is very much the case in France. They have the hand spinning technology. So one thing that you could have expected to find during the blockade is that you're only scaling up in sort of the traditional old technology in which these externalities don't exist.
Thank you. Yeah,
that's a long answer, very long.
No, I was worried about not being able to fit all of my questions within the time, but you've nicely synthesized them. And so I think we'll be able to move on to the Q&A easily as well. I think in that case, I want to step back a tiny bit, even though we've barely just sort of touched the surface of it, and ask you sort of, so we have this, so so you found that these, both on the short run and the long run, there are areas in France that were more affected by the ban, then developed better cotton industries, and also with spillover effects to other metrics of industrialization. How specific, so this would be like strong support for the infant industry argument in general, but how specific do you think this is to Northern France at that point in time? For example, like one might argue that the rest of Europe is also affected by this ban because the rest of Europe is also controlled by Napoleon. And so maybe the sort of external markets in Europe is what is allowing French industries to develop. So I guess, yeah, I just wanted your opinion on how generalizable this is, and maybe anything that you did in the paper to control for this.
So you might have been one of my referees, but one of my referees asked for exactly this point.
Maybe.
So I spent a lot of time trying to figure out the differential market access different areas of France had to what you very rightly point out, that Napoleon had control over large parts of Europe at that point, and they were kind of captive markets for French products. So that's kind of a confounding effect that you might worry about. The reason, so actually, I think that's a very plausible hypothesis. The reason it doesn't confound the results is that actually where a lot of the territories were actually favoring more southern producers, and so for that reason, it doesn't correlate so well. It doesn't correlate so much with the shock, which is why I think it doesn't destroy the results of the paper. The other sort of elephant in the room, for those of you who know sort of French geography and French economic history, the really big challenge is that the shock, although we haven't sort of explicitly said this, the shock is really stronger in northern France, as you alluded to. And so the question kind of boils down to, to what extent are the north and the south of France good comparison groups. You know, the North was probably more developed to begin with, and that's true. And so that was, I think, the biggest sort of econometric challenge, or the biggest sort of identification challenge in the paper, is to make the case that it wasn't sort of a given that the north of France would develop. Really, the area that saves me is the area around Lyon, which is kind of France's second industrial center, and they had a thriving sort of hand spinning industry. Silk is very big there, and silk and cotton could be mixed together. So they had sort of a textile industry. So sort of from kind of a very just like data perspective, the reason the reason you can't explain away the results with that is because the South sort of had a fighting chance. And then the other thing that I show in the paper is that even if you just sort of throw away most of southern France, the effects of the blockade are still discernible within the north. So because, as you alluded to, this basically because this protection is continuous, you can kind of test this hypothesis, like saying, okay, the south of France is just not comparable. Let's just look within the north of France, and even within the north of France, basically the areas around the Channel are the ones that are thriving. And so that's really, there's also a gradient in sort of the extent to which the northern you are, the more northern you are in France, the better you develop. So I think that's the other thing. I think you had a question also about sort of generalizability. I can answer that, but I can see someone else has a raised hand, so I don't know. I'll let you guys decide what you want me to do.
Maybe would you be okay if we went 5 minutes overboard?
Yeah, 5 minutes is okay. Yeah.
Okay, so, and I think then it's okay. Could we finish on maybe just the generalizability, and then I'll hand it over to Keishi to manage the questions.
Yeah. So on the generalizability, I want to both be sort of careful, but not too careful. So first of all, you know, now this is not the only paper that is finding an effect for infant industry. Now we have a couple of other papers that show similar effects. So what I would sort of conclude is that sort of in terms of kind of the economic mechanism at work, there's a strong case for infant industry. Does that have implications for trade policy in developing countries? I mean, in a crude way, no. Like, I don't think, clearly, I don't think that imposing a land blockade of your country is like a good way to do development policy. So I think in that specific sense, there's no direct policy relevance. But what I would say is that, this is telling us that the advice that we give, that we typically have given countries in the past couple of decades of like, just open your markets to free trade and development will follow, and sort of just get the prices right, sort of fix distortions in the markets. That if infant industry is a strong economic mechanism, I don't think that the policy advice of sort of free trade is going to be necessarily the right advice to give. Now, of course, in low capacity environments, getting industrial policy right is particularly challenging. And I don't want to be flippant about that, but I think this makes our problem sort of hard, because if I hadn't found an effect for infant industry, we'd be like, great. So, this is not something we need to worry about. But for a long time, all the way back to Alexander Hamilton, people have claimed this type of mechanism is preventing, countries like the US in the late 18th century, developing countries today from being able to kickstart structural transformation. I think what this is telling us is we have to do better, and we have to sort of think about how to do better. And I don't think there are easy answers there, but I think it's incumbent on us to sort of try.